Hey folks,
Hey,
sorry about the agenda issues, the Zoom link issue. Not really sure why that expired. Uh, there we go. I'm just going to ping Dennis directly. Okay. Hopefully Dennis will. Oh, hi, Ivan. Hopefully Dennis will join us. But we shall. Oh, yeah, here he's on his way. We'll wait for him for a second. Okay, awesome. Let's kick us off. So, by joining this meeting, we have all agreed to the specification membership agreement, the participation guidelines, the contribution guide, and the code of conduct, all of which are linked to in the agenda file. So you can check those out asynchronously. First, let's do a quick round of introductions. We'll do it in the order that we are in the agenda. So starting with me. Hi, everyone. I'm Benji.
Hey everyone, I'm Dennis from the Guild.
hey, I'm Yovi from Stellate.
I'm Gabriel, currently at Workday, but here on behalf of myself.
Hi, I'm Ivan. I didn't add myself to agenda. I will do that. I work at Apollo, and sadly, nobody from Apollo could join today. I'm less knowledgeable about persistent queries on Apollo side, but I'm interested to hear this discussion from working group side.
Okay, awesome. Thank you, Ivan. Okay, ideally, someone would take notes. Possibly more than one person. The docs link does actually seem to be valid, and I see some cursors in there, so this is promising. Do add yourself in there as a note taker if you are doing so that you at least get some recognition. Let's have a look at the agenda. So on the agenda today, we have looking at the accept header. We are having a look at persisted operations. There's an RFC for that. And we are talking, if there's any time left, about advancing the specification to stage 2, which has been on the cards for a long time. And is one of the reasons that I think it's great that Dennis has managed to arrive, because I think he'll be best placed to give us feedback on that. Is there anything that anyone wanted to add to the agenda or any further comments? No. Excellent. Since we have it on the agenda, I'm just going to quickly look and see if there's any action items that need to be reviewed. There is no issues that are tagged with action items, so I believe that means we're all up to date. Fantastic. So let's move on to the accept header pull request. Okay, so if I recall correctly, the discussion of this is that there was a bit of wording in the spec as it stands that fell back on the HTTP specification, specifically RFC 7231, where they say if you cannot adhere to the accept header, your choice is either reject the request as not acceptable or just serve whatever you want. And we thought, let's just copy that because that's what HTTP says. But there's been some pushback on that there has been some pushback on that for good reasons. But at the moment, what the proposed change is not to forbid doing the HTTP behavior, but instead to recommend that you return a not acceptable and a not recommended for the other option. This is, for anyone not following, this is RFC 227. Does anyone have any feedback on this? Any hesitations? Should we merge it as is? It's a relatively small change.
I'm all favor for merging as is.
Yeah, me too. Often enough, clients and implementers don't really respect the sect headers or don't even set it. They just kind of expect it to work. So they be sending requests and, kind of inherently expecting a multi-part response or whatever. So I think replying as is and not declining the request would make perfect sense. And of course, if the client itself does not support the content type that's being responded from the server, it will error out on its side. So yeah, I think the statement of recommending to not allow it and still allowing from the spec to send a different content type disregarding the accept header is just completely fine. I think I might just add some other tests to GraphQL-HTTP because I think I have one that checks the accept header and checks the response of the server. So I will probably have to add an audit or at least change an existing one. But other than that, I'm super fine with the change.
Perfect. Thank you, Dennis. That's great feedback. So if everyone can slap an approval on that pull request, and we'll get it merged after the meeting. And I think that's probably enough on that one, even though I allocated 15 minutes on it. Yovi, would you like to talk to us about persisted operations?
Yeah. So I think last month I created an RFC for persistent operations, as I have been seeing them in Relay, where we add a property, like an accepted property on the GraphQL payload to have a document ID or whatever ends up being the name that can be used on a server to translate it to a GraphQL document. That would be the first step of it. Since then, Benji has created a follow-up to that, which goes way more in depth. I think, yeah. I'm not sure, do we want to go through all of it or?
Whatever you feel. I'll just add a little bit more context to this. Persisted operations, as I'm sure we all know here, but I'll expand for the sake of YouTube, is a common pattern that has existed since before GraphQL was open sourced. Facebook uses it internally. Every query that or document, I should say, that their engineers write gets persisted, validated at that time, and then only those documents that their engineers have written are allowed to execute. We also have in the ecosystem the automatic persisted queries, which I think was spearheaded by, and the specification for that is owned by Apollo. That's an alternative form of this that allows documents to be persisted on demand. So it loses the allow listing functionalities of the traditional persisted operations, but it is still beneficial because it saves you from having to send so much data over the wire. So the amount, you don't need to send an entire big GraphQL query with all of its fragments and things like that. You can just send the hash. Yovi's proposal I think, was to formalize some of this. What I've gone and done is written up an actual modification to the GraphQL over HTTP specification. Specifically, I've added an appendix because I don't think that persisted documents are really part of the core of GraphQL over HTTP, but I think that they are effectively a supported extension of it, and a sufficiently wide enough used extension that it is worth adding to the specification itself. Now, one thing that is worth very much calling out in this regard is that at the moment, there is not really a specification for persisted documents. The idea is you hash them and you send the hash, and then at the other side, you get the hash, you look it up, and then you use that. And that's basically the advice that's been given. And so different people have done this in different ways. Relay, for example, might represent it with the document ID or even doc ID key on the request. Apollo uses the extensions property on the request. And I think some other people use putting the identifier into the URLs or even putting them into a header. There's all sorts of different ways of doing it. So the aim for this is to standardize everyone to use one particular way, or at least express the ways that are being used, so that it will increase interoperability. This RFC that I've written, which I should point out again is separate from Yovi's one, does not address automatic persisted queries. It only talks about persisting the documents themselves. Automatic persisted queries could be implemented on top of this specification, but currently there's a few parts missing in order to do that. For example, I don't think that we're right to specify anything inside of the extensions object, because the whole point of that object is that the GraphQL spec and the GraphQL Foundation doesn't dictate anything inside of that. So you may do with that what you will. And if we start specifying things inside of there, really that's telling that we need to introduce another layer inside of it that will be safe to modify. So we would need to be able to add like an error code to errors so that we know that this is a persisted operations error, and a few other similar things. So broadly, I think the aim at the moment, if I'm right, Yovi, is just to gather feedback on this to see if anyone sees any major roadblocks in it.
Yeah, that was the main goal. Like, if there's issues with, for instance, introducing a new parameter or whatever, would be good to surface all of them.
I wanted to clarify one thing. So initial issue was marked as post 1.0, right? So idea is it's not going into initial release, and it's like merged only after initial and discussed like merge like the whole stages procedure run only after initial release, right? Or plan changed?
On that front, it doesn't really matter particularly when it is merged. I think the reason for that label was like, we'll look at this once the rest of the spec is done, and effectively the rest of the spec is done. So we are now at like about the point to cut 1.0, I think. So this, yeah, I think it would effectively go in after the 1.0 release, but I mean, effectively, we need to advance this through the stages as well. So the spec itself will talk about raising that to stage 2, and then hopefully in a future month into stage 3, and that will be the 1.0 release. And then we can add the persisted documents afterwards, or before. Like, if everyone agrees that it's fantastic as it is and everyone's in alignment, then there's no particular reason we couldn't merge it before.
One thing, it's kind of strange. Idea was that everybody would support 1.0 and everybody would be kind of compatible. Like, at least like effort to be compatible is pretty low. But with, as you say, like servers supporting Relay, the support persistent queries, but in different way. Apollo now Apollo supports not only automatic persistent queries, but persistent queries in the own format. And now suddenly Apollo doing something which is not 1.0. So like from perception of compatibility and like the entire optics, it would be better to release 1.0 without it. Everybody like low effort compatibility. Maybe like I need to read it, and like people at Apollo need to read it and figure out if we like compatible with everything which is in current version. I think David Glasser previously said there is some things we maybe need to change, but it would be bad if suddenly like Relay and Apollo and probably other implementation is not doing what's written in 1.0, and there is no time frame to adjust or discuss. So we will be in a situation we either like need to discuss it in Apollo if we want to adjust our implementation to this implementation. And in that case, it would be strange to put like 1.0 in draft 2 if this included, because there is like some incompatibilities and it's look like last minute addition. So like my point is from vendor's point of view, it would be better to release it without persistent queries and later like follow up a stage. So like we will have one happy public release 1.0 that will say everybody kind of adhere to it and adhere even to more or less like optional things in the spec.
Yeah, I can add to that. My thoughts are the spec without it can still be considered complete. And so there's no real need to bring it in. And given that it would delay and it may cause confusion right at the moment, and as Ivan said, there could be teams or products who would say, all of a sudden, even though I thought I was compliant, I'm not. And so I feel it's just best to wait until after.
Yeah, I'm absolutely happy with all of that. That sounds entirely reasonable. We can still advance it through the stages, but just not merge it when it hits the stage 3.
One question: what happens with the query parameter?
Yeah, so in my RFC, it becomes optional, but it's more like it has a payload either has to have document ID in there or query. Well, or for the case if we want to introduce APQ, maybe both, but like one of the two has to be present.
Yeah, my proposal is similar. What I've actually written up in the RFC is effectively that it works a bit like a middleware in front of, or a pre-process step, which has had a little bit of pushback, I think, from GraphQL.net, if I remember correctly. But effectively, a persisted operation has the document ID, and if you receive such a query, then the persisted operation part should take that persisted operation request and then convert it to a regular GraphQL over HTTP request by effectively turning it into a request that contains query instead. So it broadly works in a similar way to how certainly persisted operations seems to have worked in the JavaScript ecosystem for a long time. As far as I'm aware, I'm not super familiar with the other ecosystems. And to your point, Ivan, I think that the amount of changes that Apollo would need to make to do persisted operations or to be compatible with the spec is literally just reading the ID from document ID rather than from extensions.sha256 hash. I think that is literally the only difference. I might be wrong, and I'd love to. I know David Glass is very experienced about this, so I'm certainly happy to discuss that with him if he thinks there's more other stuff. He's certainly caught some issues in the past.
Yeah, clarification. I was referring to issues that he caught like a year ago, and he said like we compatible with 1.0 version. So I was referring to that. About persistent queries, I don't know, like current state of discussion. Maybe teams discovered something else. But I'm not in that team. I didn't participate in this feature, so I'm like cannot provide technical expertise what's compatible and what not. So it sounds like everything is compatible, but.
Yeah, I imagine it would be a couple of lines of code needed in like Apollo server, and then you'd be fine. But yeah, absolutely. I support putting it after the 1.0 release, and then effectively it'll be in the draft until we cut another 1.1 release or whatever at some point.
I have a question for the group on this. As you said, Benji, anything in the extensions area is up to the implementer to decide what goes in there. Is there an implication then that Apollo is already compliant because they're doing whatever they want in there and the rest of it would match the spec? Or is there
let me just scan over my text to answer that correctly.
It's not critical because I still support, even if that's true, I still support waiting just to give us time to review and get further feedback. But it was just a curiosity. I mean, in more general terms,
Yeah, I can provide you feedback on that. Like what happens in reality, like someone from a client read the spec and say like, spec provide this way using this name of parameter, and you do it differently, but in specs it said like that, and it's official GraphQL spec, and you should implement it. It's one scenario. Another scenario, like some client work by default or without like patches, or work with like stuff that's written in a spec, and it's like pushing on a vendor suddenly, and suddenly it's become not theoretical issue but a client issue. So it's always better to give time to adjust, and it's like create less tensions in because it's one thing if you're ready and you're given the time to adopt. Another thing if client you get pushed into standard by like some angry, not happy client. So yeah, this is my point. So yeah, in reality, it's usually happens like that.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And to answer your question, Gabriel, the current Apollo implementation would not be compliant because we do explicitly require that you support the document ID field. And I think it also means that Relay is not compliant, or some versions of Relay are not, because they use doc_ID. They seem to have actually changed it over the years, which one they use. So again, this is just us trying to add a standard that everyone can implement that not necessarily everyone does. And I completely bow to Ivan's point that the whole point of the 1.0 release is basically this is what everyone's doing already. So that is not the right point to fight this battle on. But I think it can easily slip into 1.1 because we're all pretty much doing it already. We're not far off.
Sorry for steering back the conversation to the query parameter. I'm just thinking from the perspective of the GraphQL-HTTP audit test suite. So if there is no query parameter, and of course, like if there is no variables and things like that, I don't consider the incoming request as a well-formatted GraphQL over HTTP request. How would I know that it is that the server is, or that the client is like responding and talking in terms of persisted operations if I'm doing the audit and the server is fine without having the query parameter?
Yeah, that's a great question, Dennis. So the idea with a lot of the whole point of having the extensions object is that if people add custom stuff, then they should put it into the extensions object, which is exactly what Apollo's done, which is the right thing. And it's not what Relay has done. They've just added it as a root level key. So I would argue that Relay didn't do it the right way. That said, when we specify it as part of the GraphQL Foundation, we should not use something inside of extensions, as previously discussed. We should have a top level thing. So I think what you would do is look at the incoming request, and if it has a document ID entry, then it is a persisted request. If it doesn't, then you would look for query. So even if it has query as well, that is a questionable state that is not currently discussed. Like having a document ID and a query is not supported right now. And how that would work has not been nailed down. And it's one of the things I'd like to talk with Apollo about more. It might be that we just stick with what Apollo does, or and just leave the automatic persisted queries spec as it is with Apollo, or it might be that we try and bring it over into the GraphQL Foundation. I put that ball in Apollo's court personally.
Cool. Just one more point. Sorry, Gabriel, for cutting you off. Talking about Relay and saying that it's not compliant, it is not technically true because Relay does not implement their own network layer. So it's still up to the user to decide how to format the Relay request over the network. So Relay will, of course, still be compliant if the user follows the spec when formatting the requests over the network.
Yes, that's true. And that's also probably true for Apollo as well, because you can, do custom network layers with Apollo client, for example. And presumably you can do middlewares with Apollo server as well, which could then make it conform to whatever Apollo needs.
To clarify, problem is not Apollo have commercial product. It's router, federation router. Now it's called GraphOS. The entire thing is called GraphOS. So we have it's also open source. Federation 2 built on a custom server written in Rust. So persistent queries supported in that. It's not only Apollo server and Apollo client, it's also commercial offering which should work with Apollo client. So yeah, you can change network layers in open source project. You cannot change network layer in a cloud commercial product.
Good to know. Well, we'd love further feedback from Apollo on this. That would be great.
Can I make one point? I'm looking over the existing spec now for GraphQL over HTTP. And one thing related to persistent queries or persistent operations is seemingly relevant. Right now, it says a GraphQL over HTTP request is an HTTP request that encodes the following parameters in one of the manners described in this specification. And the first bullet point says query as required. So if I had a persisted operation that did not include query because I didn't need one, am I now non-compliant because I'm choosing to do something that's not yet part of the spec?
Yes, if you do something like that doesn't have query in it, then that is not a GraphQL over HTTP specification compliant request, and that's totally fine, because in the spec we allow you to handle other requests however you want. So effectively, the point of the spec is for compatibility. So if someone wants to send you an arbitrary thing, they need to send you query. If you've got an arrangement with the server, you can do what you want there. and that's your personal arrangement. But like for the compatibility point of view, yes, query is required.
Right.
And when it comes to the persisted documents, that is modeled not as a GraphQL over HTTP request, but as a separate name of a request. And it's implementing it is also optional. One thing on that point as well, actually, is that we have no signaling at the moment to say this server supports persisted documents. And this is something that we've talked about a number of times at the GraphQL over HTTP working group over the years. Like, we need ways of saying, you know, we support subscriptions, we support WebSockets, we support this, we support that. This is yet another thing in this. But I think we can still, once 1.0 is out, I think we can still merge the persisted document spec as is and address the signaling issue in a separate RFC.
That works. Thank you.
Okay, fantastic. So yeah, anyone who's able to look at that RFC, give it a read, see if it covers everything, see if there's any major glaring issues, and especially look at, if you're already using persisted documents, look at your current implementations and see whether it's going to be much effort to support. I really hope that it isn't. It was designed to be very flexible. Then let us know, give some feedback on that PR. So let's move on to discussing advancing the spec to stage 2. Dennis, if possible, I'd like to actually hand over to you for this. Broadly, my question to you is this: you've implemented the GraphQL over HTTP spec, and you've implemented a test suite for it, and you've then helped or implemented the tests for many of the GraphQL servers that are out there in the ecosystem. How are we doing? Should we move to stage 2? Like, do you see any issues that need resolving first?
Hell yeah. That's all I can say for this. Basically, all of the servers that I've been testing in the test suite, they are compliant in terms of the requirements. There are some optional things that some servers don't implement. And also there are some deprecated that don't follow in a few areas, like what's the name of it? Helix, I think it is. But I think like it's a smidge of change to alter those servers and get it working. Other than that, I've been welcoming all PRs in terms of getting the servers in from the community if they have their own implementations. I've gotten only a few, but those that I have, they are all compliant and listed in the README itself. So yeah, I think we are ready.
That's awesome news. And thank you so much for the amount of effort that you've put into that. I know it's been a lot of work for you, and we all appreciate it. Okay, so fantastic. I move that we advance the GraphQL over HTTP spec to stage 2. I think what we should probably do is open a pull request with that change, which I can take that on. And we'll leave that open for a few weeks for anyone to pass any hesitations. But does anyone here have any hesitations? I'm getting shakes of the head. So yeah, that sounds fantastic. Let's do that. So we'll start the ball rolling for moving this to stage 2. And then the next thing after that will be starting the ball rolling for moving it to stage 3, because I think most of us are treating it as if it's stage 2 already, if I'm honest. Awesome.
What does that look like from the main working group point of view?
Yeah, that is a great question. So Lee has effectively said that we're operating it as a separate specification, so it doesn't technically need sign-off from the main working group. That said, the main working group is very knowledgeable, so I think it is definitely worth passing it through them once we've got to stage 2 to say, hey, this is what we plan to ship as stage 3. Do you have any hesitations with it? But as we've stated before, this is really what everyone is doing anyway. So I don't think there will be any particular pushback. When it comes to actually cutting the 1.0 release, I believe there might actually be some legal work involved in that. I know when we did one of the first cuts of the GraphQL spec after establishing the working group, and I think that wasn't until like 2019 that we actually did the cut. One of the members of the Linux Foundation had to spend a lot of time tracking down all the contributors and getting signatures from them. So it's possible that we may need to do something similar. But that's a legal thing that the Linux Foundation will help organize, I expect. I will figure out with Lee what is needed on that regard. But hopefully it's just a case of putting a stamp on it, passing it along, waiting for the legal work to be done, and then pushing it out.
Awesome.
Yeah. I want to suggest one thing. Since I wrote initial documents years ago, and back when we didn't have TSC, so I just moved a repo from my own personal repo into Foundation, and I just asked Lee and I asked on main group, working group, everybody said, oh, okay, let's try that as experiment. And from experiment, it's moving toward official release. And now we have TST. So usually Benja, you also involved there, and there is usually not a lot of discussion or anybody opposing anything. I suggest just to be on the formal side, since GraphQL over HTTP was never officially accepted. I kind of moved into use Git command interface to move into group. I would suggest for 1.0 just have a small waiting thing for waiting, saying we will release 1.0 as official spec on the GraphQL Foundation, and after that we will manage subsequent release as our own group. And if everybody agreed to that, and probably everybody will agree to that, but in this case we will give a chain of authority, because this event never happened in a way this group started. I'm happy that I transfer this document, and when thanks a lot for picking it up, because at some point I did have enough capability to manage this meeting. So thanks. But now I think for this moment 1.0 release, I think we can use this opportunity to make it official, in a sense, rubber stamped. And because now, as you said, it's it's Lee said in oral speech, so there is no chain of authority, but we have with TC institution, so I suggest using it. Especially since it's there is not a lot of bureaucracy, and usually it's done with single email and waiting a week for people to reply.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think as part of the TSC, I sort of included in the legal work, because we as the TSC need to vote to approve this thing. And I think that's true for any of the specifications that the GraphQL Foundation releases. So yeah, 100% agree. The TSC will vote on the final release before it is properly released. And I think that's already... I'll need to find out from Lee exactly what the procedure on that is.
Yeah, I mean, in this waiting, you can include that subsequent release. It's not it's not required to pass through this procedure. So 1.1, and because basically it's not everybody will have capacity to read through a document and rubber stamp something that you didn't read. What's the sense of that? So maybe in this initial voting, just include like it's officially adopted, it's 1.0, and unless somebody opposes, group will self-govern itself. It's my proposal to do, and like include like that in this official voting, not only 1.0, but like adoption of a whole spec, because technically it was never adopted. It's a new project that happened after GraphQL Foundation, but it was never officially adopted into GraphQL Foundation. Yeah, so I think
I would argue that that's not really needed, and I'll point to a whole bunch of RFCs that aren't really officially accepted. They're just added in the repo and then considered, and then there was a point at the end where we say, okay, let's take this RFC on to be official. I think as long as Benji said, the group is going to have that discussion and more or less an official agreement after the fact. I don't think it matters how it got there.
Okay, like maybe I'm there is like in TC like responsibility of TC thing. There is like point of accepting projects into not a spec. I'm not meaning like every markdown document and every repo, but accepting a repo. This procedure is never happened. And like the whole effort was never like officially weighted. So like it's not a big deal, but I think since we will publish something and the foundation, it makes sense to like have this like weight just for sake of like not having a discussion problems or something in future.
Yeah, I think we'll definitely have to do that anyway, like because that's just required for the legal side of releasing a spec under the GraphQL Foundation. So I think that is required, and it's all kind of covered under the necessary legal steps that need to take place. And the TSC are the people that vote on that. Regarding your other point of not necessarily having to do it for 1.1, I'd like to say that we've been saying the release 1.0, but it's not really 1.0. It will be a release of, for example, June 2024, just like the GraphQL spec is named after a particular month and year. It'll be the same for the GraphQL-over-HTTP spec, and I suspect that we'll only have one official release like that every year, 18 months, 2 years, whatever makes sense. So we can still merge things like the persisted documents. We can merge that in, and that goes into the draft, and all these other changes can be merged into the draft. And then at some point we'll cut an official release. And at that point, I still think that we should have the TSC vote on it. And I think actually we have to, according to the charter, but I'm not 100% sure. So again, I'll check with Lee on the specifics of the legal work there. Okay, thank you everyone for your feedback. I will open a pull request with the changes of moving this to RFC stage 2. And then what I think I'll do, unless anyone has any hesitation, is I will also add this to, I was going to say the next GraphQL working group, but that's only in a week. Maybe to that one, maybe to the December one, to say, yeah, we'll do that. We'll do the December one. So we'll raise this as an RFC stage 2. Hopefully leave it open for a few weeks to get our own feedback on it. Assuming no one has any hesitations, we'll then move it to stage 2, and then we'll present it to the GraphQL working group in December. That's my plan.
It might be helpful in the meeting in 1 week that you give a heads up, though.
Absolutely, can do that. Yeah, I'll add a 3-minute item to the agenda. Okay, awesome. I hope someone captured those action items in the notes. Unless we have anything else to discuss, I think we can call this meeting a little early. Yep, sounds good. All right, thanks everyone. Catch you next time. Bye.
Bye-bye.